My name is Clara Vance. I'm 23 years old, and I'm a freelance graphic designer, mostly doing small business logos and event flyers. But on that particular Christmas Eve, I was just a girl in a worn coat, trying to stay out of the biting wind behind the community center. The air smelled of pine needles and stale gravy, and my stomach rumbled so loudly I worried someone might hear it over the distant carols. I watched as families, bundled in their best, spilled out of the center after the annual free holiday dinner, carrying platters of half-eaten turkey and mashed potatoes. When the last family car pulled away, I moved from the shadows, my eyes scanning the discarded aluminum trays in the overflowing bins, looking for anything salvageable. That's when I heard the distinct, low rumble of an expensive engine. I froze, a half-eaten dinner roll clutched in my gloved hand, as a sleek, dark Bentley, polished to a mirror sheen, glided to a stop just a few yards away. The window hummed down, revealing the stern, familiar face of my grandfather, Arthur Vance, a man I hadn't seen in over a decade. His gaze, usually sharp and distant, softened for a fleeting second as he took in my ragged appearance, the scraps in my hand. I braced myself for a lecture, a dismissal, anything but what happened next. That single moment, him seeing me at my lowest, changed everything, not just for me, but for my entire family, exposing a web of lies that had kept us apart for years. To understand why I was picking through trash on Christmas Eve, you need to know about the two sides of my family. My mother, Susan, came from a modest background. My father, David, however, was the only son of Arthur Vance, a man who had built a small empire in commercial real estate. Grandpa Arthur wasn't a flashy man, despite the Bentley, he was old money, quiet wealth, the kind that didn't need to prove itself. He and Grandma Eleanor lived in a beautiful, sprawling house in the older part of Brookside, a town known for its manicured lawns and generational wealth. I remembered visiting as a small child, the scent of Grandma Eleanor's lavender sachets, the polished wood of the banister, and a small, hand-painted ceramic bird ornament that always hung on their Christmas tree, a tiny robin with a chipped wing. It was a cherished family heirloom, a symbol of their enduring presence. Then, when I was around 8, the visits stopped. My mother, Susan, told us that Grandpa Arthur was a cruel, domineering man who had disowned my father for choosing her, a woman he deemed unsuitable. She painted a picture of a cold, heartless patriarch who only cared about money and status. My father, a gentle and soft-spoken man, never contradicted her. He would just sigh, his eyes distant, and say, "It's complicated, Clara. Your mother has her reasons." After a few years, my father lost his job as an accountant at a local firm. He never really recovered, slipping into a quiet depression, and then, a few years after that, his health began to decline. It started with fatigue, then chronic pain, and eventually, a diagnosis of fibromyalgia that made it impossible for him to hold down a regular job. We moved from our modest suburban house to a small, cramped apartment, and the bills piled up. My mother became the sole breadwinner, working 2 part-time jobs, but it was never enough. She always insisted that if Grandpa Arthur hadn't cut us off, we wouldn't be in this mess. I tried to help, taking on small graphic design gigs in high school and college, but it barely covered my art supplies, let alone rent or groceries. I'd watch my mother count out change for milk, her face drawn and tired, and I'd feel a bitter resentment towards this mythical, cruel grandfather who had supposedly abandoned us. There was one particularly harsh winter when my father's pain was so bad he couldn't get out of bed for days. My mother called a distant cousin of my father's, Aunt Carol, hoping for some help with medical bills. Aunt Carol, who still lived in Brookside, offered to talk to Grandpa Arthur, but my mother flatly refused. "Don't you dare involve that man," she'd snapped, her voice tight with anger. "He'd only offer it with strings attached, to humiliate us. We'll manage on our own." I remembered the way Aunt Carol's voice sounded, genuinely concerned, before my mother hung up. That detail mattered later. The years passed, marked by constant struggle. My father grew thinner, his spirit dimmed, and my mother became increasingly rigid, her stories about Grandpa Arthur growing darker, more embellished. She claimed he'd even tried to pay her to leave my father, an accusation that always made my father flinch. I started to notice how my mother would intercept mail, especially anything that looked official or had a return address from Brookside. She'd open it, read it quickly, and then often tear it up, claiming it was junk mail or another one of his passive-aggressive attempts to control us. I remembered once finding a beautifully handwritten card with a small check inside, clearly from Grandma Eleanor, tucked into the recycling bin. When I asked my mother about it, she said, "Oh, that old thing?" It was a sympathy card for someone else. I must have mixed it up. But Grandma Eleanor had passed away 3 years prior. The inconsistency nagged at me, a tiny crack in the narrative. That Christmas Eve, with the cold biting through my coat and the shame burning my cheeks, was the culmination of all those years. My father was having a particularly bad flare-up, and my mother had spent her last few dollars on a small, sad turkey for Christmas Day. There was nothing left for tonight, and my pride had finally crumbled. I had promised myself I'd only take what was truly discarded, but the sight of my grandfather's Bentley, a symbol of everything we lacked, pulled me back to the present with a jolt. He didn't say a word, just watched me. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached across the passenger seat and opened the door. "Clara," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "get in. We need to talk." My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the dinner roll, then at the gleaming interior of the car, and without a word, I climbed in. The inside of the Bentley was warm, smelling faintly of leather and something vaguely citrusy. Grandpa Arthur drove in silence for a few minutes, away from the community center, towards the wealthier part of town. He didn't take me to his house. Instead, he pulled into the parking lot of a quiet, upscale diner that was still open. "Are you hungry?" he asked, turning off the engine. I nodded, too choked up to speak. Over plates of hot roast beef and mashed potatoes, real ones, not the instant kind, he finally spoke. "I saw you, Clara. And I've been seeing your father, too." My fork clattered against the plate. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He explained that he'd been trying to reach my father for years, ever since Grandma Eleanor passed away, to offer support and to reconnect. He'd sent letters, made calls, even tried to visit, but my mother had always intercepted him, claiming David didn't want anything to do with him, that he was too ill to be disturbed or too angry. "After Eleanor died," he continued, his eyes sad, "I truly believed your father hated me. Susan made sure of it. She told me David blamed me for his career setbacks, for his health. She even told me he'd instructed her to refuse any financial assistance, saying he wanted nothing from that old tyrant. He paused, taking a sip of water. "But then, a few months ago, I saw David at the grocery store. He looked unwell. And he looked right through me, like a ghost. I realized he was on his own, not with your mother. I tried to approach him, but he hurried away, looking frightened. That was when the numbers stopped looking accidental. Grandpa Arthur, being a shrewd businessman, decided to investigate. He hired a private investigator, a former police detective he trusted, to discreetly look into my father's situation. What the investigator found was a mountain of evidence, unopened letters from Arthur, some containing checks, hidden away in a safe deposit box my mother had rented, medical bills that had gone unpaid, despite funds being available, and a pattern of my mother actively isolating my father from any contact with his side of the family. The investigator even found records of my mother selling some of my father's inherited stocks, claiming they were joint assets to cover family expenses, but the money had vanished into accounts only she controlled. "Your mother has been telling us both a different story, Clara," Grandpa Arthur said, his voice hard now, stripped of its earlier gentleness. "She painted me as a monster to you and your father, and she painted your father as an ungrateful, resentful son to me. All to control the narrative and, it seems, the finances." He pulled a thick folder from his briefcase, placing it on the table between us. It was filled with copies of bank statements, intercepted letters, and the investigator's detailed reports. My hands trembled as I leafed through them, seeing the truth laid bare. The ceramic bird ornament, the one with the chipped wing, flashed in my mind. It wasn't just a symbol of family, it was a symbol of what had been broken and hidden. The next day, Christmas morning, was not a quiet, joyous affair. Grandpa Arthur arrived at our cramped apartment, not in the Bentley, but but in a more modest sedan, accompanied by a stern-faced woman who introduced herself as his attorney, Ms. Davies. My father, frail but with a spark of hope in his eyes, sat on the worn armchair. My mother, Susan, stood stiffly by the window, her face a mask of suspicion. Susan, Grandpa Arthur began, his voice calm but unwavering, we need to discuss David's care and the family's finances. He laid the folder on our small coffee table. I have Evie. Denke hear that you have deliberately withheld contact between David and me, intercepted correspondence, and mismanaged funds intended for his well-being. My mother's face went pale. What are you talking about? She stammered, her voice rising. This is outrageous. You're trying to ruin us, just like you always did. Ms. Davies stepped forward, her voice crisp. Mrs. Vance, we have documentation of several checks from Mr. Arthur Vance, intended for David, that were deposited into accounts solely controlled by you. We also have records of you selling inherited assets without David's consent, and the subsequent disappearance of those funds from any shared family accounts. Furthermore, we have sworn statements from relatives and neighbors confirming your efforts to isolate David. She placed another document on the table, a legal notice. We are prepared to pursue legal action for financial elder abuse and fraud. My mother looked from the documents to my father, then to me, her eyes wild. Clara, tell them. Tell them he's lying. He's always been cruel. But I couldn't. I just looked at her, the pieces of the puzzle finally fitting together. The intercepted mail, the strange excuses, the constant blame. The truth was too clear. My father, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke. Susan, he said, his voice weak but firm, is this true? She tried to deny it, to spin more tales, but the weight of the evidence, and the presence of the attorney, crushed her usual bravado. They're trying to take everything from us, David, she cried, but her words lacked conviction. Grandpa Arthur simply shook his head. I'm not trying to take anything, Susan. I'm trying to ensure David receives the care he needs and that Clara has a chance at a future. Effective immediately, I am establishing a trust for David's medical care and living expenses, to be managed by a neutral third party. And Clara, I'm setting up a separate fund for your education and to help you establish your graphic design business. He looked directly at my mother. You will no longer have access to David's finances, nor will you be involved in his medical decisions. If you attempt to interfere, we will proceed with the full legal action we've outlined. The aftermath was painful but necessary. My mother, stripped of her control, left the apartment a few weeks later, unable to face the reality she had created. She moved in with a distant relative, claiming she was the victim of a malicious plot. My father, with access to proper medical care and a renewed sense of connection to his family, slowly began to heal. He still had his pain, but the crushing weight of financial stress and emotional isolation lifted, and he started to regain some of his old spark. Grandpa Arthur, it turned out, wasn't the cold tyrant my mother had described. He was a man who valued family and honesty above all else, deeply hurt by the perceived rejection, but willing to fight for what was right when he saw the truth. He helped me secure a small studio space, and I enrolled in advanced digital art courses. My graphic design business began to flourish, and I no longer had to worry about picking scraps. Grandpa Arthur and I developed a close relationship, spending Sundays talking about art, business, and family history. He told me stories about Grandma Eleanor, stories I'd never heard, and he showed me old photographs. On our first Christmas together in his home, after years of estrangement, I noticed the ceramic bird ornament hanging on the tree, its chipped wings still visible. It wasn't broken anymore, not really. It was a reminder of resilience, of things lost and found, and of the truth that, sometimes, the greatest gifts arrive when you're at your lowest, carried by the most unexpected hands.